My name is Sandra Simmons, and I co-direct the USDeN Pilot and Grant Funding Corps with my colleague, Dr. Amanda Mixon. We are both at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and we also both have VA affiliations with Tennessee Valley. And we have done several deprescribing intervention trials together. So we work a lot together on this polypharmacy issue. And we have a wonderful panel today with some of our prior awardees focused on benzodiazepines. Should I go ahead and go through a few? So we have Dr. Gurjeet Birdi from Vanderbilt University. He's an integrative medicine specialist and founder of the Mind Body Evolution. His NIH-funded work explores yoga, mindfulness, and tech-enabled therapies for chronic disease. We also have Dr. Elizabeth Addington from Northwestern University. She's a health psychologist whose research improves well-being in people with cancer and chronic illness using yoga, mindfulness, and positive psychology tools, including digital delivery. We have Dr. Erica Sharp from the National University of Natural Medicine, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Healthcott Institute. Her work spans yoga therapy, music, and natural products in promoting sleep and well-being, including clinical trials on yoga nidra. And Dr. Tim Anderson from the University of Pittsburgh, who will be joining us via Zoom, I believe, who's a primary care physician and health services researcher at Pitt, where he leads the Prescribing Wisely Lab. His work focuses on optimizing medication use and mentoring deprescribing investigators. And then, Amanda, I'll let you introduce. We have two discussants as well for the panel.
Yes, we have two discussants. One is Dr. Marcel Salive from the NIA. He is the program officer for the US Deprescribing Research Network. He'll be joining us by Zoom. And then we also have Dr. Constance Fung at the end of the panel here. She's a geriatrician and sleep medicine physician at UCLA. Her work focuses on behavioral sleep interventions for older adults and advancing geriatric research through national collaborations. And so Dr. Salive and Dr. Fung will have a discussion at the end of all of the presentations. So first up is Dr. Addington.
Hi, everybody. I'm Liz. Thanks for having me. I'm here to talk to you about the ALDER study, anxiety lowering and deprescribing through emotion regulation. This is based off the positive pathways to health model that my colleague Judy Moskowitz and I developed. It's based on a body of evidence showing that positive emotions aren't just the absence or low levels of negative emotions. They're their own unique experience, and they can co-occur with negative emotions, improve coping with stress, and improve health and well-being. And we've seen this in observational studies and trials with people facing a number of different stressors and illnesses, including, you may have heard of our work last fall through NPR in the lead up to the national election here in the US. We usually teach people somewhere between 8 and 10 skills that can increase positive emotions. The package sort of depends on the population, but these are the skills that we had in the ALDER study for older adults who are candidates for deprescribing from benzos and Z drugs. The ALDER study, we started with a previous version of the intervention and then went through focus groups and interviews with older adults who may be participants in a study like this, along with clinicians who prescribe these medications to do some tailoring of the intervention. We then conducted a single-arm pilot trial where we recruited patients from primary care here at Northwestern and gave participants access to the ALDER skills in the web-based version. We collected patient-reported outcomes at baseline and post-intervention. We also did weekly symptom monitoring to look for symptoms of withdrawal and other potential safety concerns. We have data on their prescriptions from Epic, and we also did follow-up interviews to learn more about any additional tailoring that may be needed for the future. So in our pilot trial, we ended up with 33 eligible participants. You can see their average age was about 73. We had about 40% men in this trial, which is actually pretty good for trials like this. Where we didn't do as well is with non-Hispanic ethnicity. So we actually tried to oversample for people from minoritized racial and ethnic backgrounds. Ended up with close to 20% Black participants, and a couple of Asian participants, but none with Hispanic background. On average, we saw that participants had about 2 medical conditions. And you can see here that about half of our participants are taking these medications for anxiety or stress, but a lot of folks on these meds for sleep, which I think was a big factor in some of our results. So as a reminder, we had 8 skills in this package. What you can see on the left side is that we had 10 people out of our 33 who didn't even try any of the skills. And then we had 12 who did all the skills, and then sort of a range in between. We also had some trouble with retention. Only about half of our sample stayed in the follow-up for the post-intervention measures. With a small sample like this, of course, there's not a lot we can say about statistical significance, but these first set of measures are promise. And so the ones that I've put in bold are ones where we see a sign of clinical significance or an actual minimal important difference. For example, anxiety at baseline, the median was in a mild elevation range, and then at follow-up was within normal limits. We also see a significant increase in meaning and purpose there too, and maybe a little bit of a signal in terms of self-reported usage of these medications. We had some really interesting results about what does an older adult look like, and how that might inform our especially online intervention and representation of older adults. We heard qualitatively that some of the skills were helpful. In some cases, people were delaying or replacing their medication use with the skills use. I think we ran into a lot of trouble with people who were looking to this more for sleep rather than anxiety. So that's something we need to separate out in the future. Got some good feedback about improving the website. Again, recruitment and retention that need to be enhanced going forward. And we are still, shall I say, combing through the EPIC data on prescriptions. So continued work there. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me today. I'm going to talk about our pilot feasibility trial, which was called C-STARS, which stands for Confidence Building Strategies to Reduce Sedative Medications. The aim of this study was to use mixed methods to evaluate the feasibility and acceptability of a novel, brief benzodiazepine deprescribing intervention in primary care. And this intervention consisted of 2 components. The first was a pharmacist-led tapering program, which was adapted from a prior successful, essentially quality improvement project that our team led, and which you all can read about in Journal of the American Geriatric Society. But really, this was modeled off regular check-ins between a pharmacist and a patient to taper benzodiazepines, in which the patient picks a tapering goal, and PCPs, while kept aware, are generally not very heavily involved. Added to that was the incorporation of mindful cognitive behavioral therapy. And here, the CBT was really focused specifically on increasing self-efficacy or increasing perceived competence to discontinue benzodiazepines. And so, as opposed to targeting specifically sleep or specific anxiety, here we were really thinking about decreasing the fears and negative beliefs associated with tapering and increasing coping strategies and kind of how people respond to the difficulties they face while tapering. So the program was 10 weeks long, and basically every 2 weeks there was a pharmacist check-in, and at that point a decision was made on further tapering. And then there were 3 45-minute psychologist CBT sessions at weeks 0, 2, and 6. And each one of these was really designed to be virtual and to be relatively brief for patients. The CBT components in the first week were really focused on expectation setting and teaching patients coping strategies and mindfulness skills. And then the subsequent 2 weeks were focused on talking about successes and challenges since the prior session and problem solving with patients on how to manage withdrawal symptoms or concerns about continued tapers. This was evaluated in a single-arm pilot trial that recruited from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and their surrounding primary care clinics, and included older adults regularly using benzodiazepines either for anxiety or sleep or both, and excluded patients with very severe depression or anxiety symptoms or who their PCP recommended they not be approached. We looked at feasibility acceptability, and I'll focus mostly on the benzodiazepine use as well as symptoms measured through PROMIS forums for anxiety and sleep disturbance. So in terms of feasibility, it was kind of a good news, bad news study. So the bad news, which is really, really hard to recruit patients, we contacted over 440 patients and enrolled 17 in total, leaving a very low recruitment rate. Many patients like their benzodiazepines. But the good news was that of those who were recruited, we had 100% retention and 100% adherence to the 6 study visits. And you can see that the patients were largely over the age of 70, predominantly male, predominantly white, and more than half of the patients had been on their benzodiazepines for over 10 years, though generally they were a relatively low dose of benzodiazepine users. Here I'm showing you the individual trajectories of benzodiazepine use over the 10 weeks. And if you focus on the blue or the orange lines, those are the mean and the median. So the relative dose change from whatever their starting dose was when they entered the trial to trial end, the mean reduction was 60%. As you can see, as patients picked different goals, typically of 50% or less, many patients, or a handful of patients, discontinued completely, but all dose reduced to some extent. Here I'm showing you PROMIS anxiety and PROMIS sleep T-scores. For both of these, the higher the score, the worse the symptoms. And you can see that neither changed dramatically from study start to study end in the population. There was actually a small, though probably not clinically meaningful, reduction in anxiety scores at 10 weeks and no difference in sleep disturbance. We also did a handful of qualitative exit interviews with patients, and I won't show you those given time, but happy to talk about them as we go forward. But what we concluded was that the study is fairly feasible and the intervention is acceptable, but recruitment is really a heavy challenge for kind of cold calling, enrolling primary care patients in benzodiazepine. We had a positive signal for change in benzodiazepine dose without worsening of anxiety or sleep. And patients really reported kind of a focus on the fact that they did feel that they had increased self-efficacy to continue tapers. And many actually said that if the program was longer, they'd plan to continue to taper, which was a big piece of the feedback we got, was that 10 weeks may just simply be too short. And that's all I've got. My co-principal investigator in this, who I just want to mention, is Gloria Ye, who directs integrative medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess. And that's our study team. And of course, thanks to USDeN and the funders.
Thank you for the opportunity to share our study and our interim results. We're still finishing up our project. It's titled Augmenting Benzodiazepine Receptor Agonist Deep Prescribing with Yoga and Acupuncture for Among Older Adults. We appreciate the support of USDeN, NCCIH, and NIA. The goal of our study was to evaluate the feasibility of an experimental treatment which combined BRZA deprescribing with integrative treatments among older adults, 65 years of age and older. And this was a single-arm feasibility study over 12 weeks. And participants had an opportunity for weekly visits that included 3 treatments: deprescribing sessions with a nurse practitioner that was protocol-driven, acupuncture treatments, and yoga instruction with guidance for home practice. Our aims were focused on feasibility, and that included our ability to enroll and retain participants, fidelity, adherence, and acceptability of the integrative treatments, and of course, outcome assessments, which was changes in BRZA dosing, and as with the other pilots, PROMIS anxiety and PROMIS sleep. This slide displays the schedule of evaluation and treatments, which includes electronic screening of health records to identify potential patients. And then we followed that with additional phone and interviews to screen patients. We assessed fidelity and adherence on a weekly basis through the study treatments. And then at the end, we used surveys to assess acceptability of the studies, of the interventions. And then we did major outcome assessments at baseline for 8 and 12 weeks, which continues to be occurring. So this just shows a summary of our screening and enrollment. So we screened about 500 patients electronically, and we identified about half as eligible. Among those, we enrolled 23 participants. The primary reason for not enrolling participants was the inability to contact them, even if we found them eligible. Among those that were enrolled, as of this slide, we have 15 people who are either completed or still receiving treatments, with 8 withdrawals. This slide shows the characteristics of our study population. Similar to the other studies, median age of 70, 60% female, very homogeneous population for studies in Nashville, all non-Hispanic white. About half of all participants were taking BRZAs or benzos for anxiety or insomnia. And the baseline dose of benzos when converted to diazepam equivalents for the past week was 3.15 milligrams with a wide range. This is some bar graphs showing participant adherence to the treatment interventions. And actually, for those who are enrolled in the study, the adherence actually has been excellent. As you can see by the blue, those are people who completed. So among the 5 people, by the time this slide was prepared, we had over 100% of people attended 80% or more of offered sessions, so very high adherence. And that's been consistent with the people who are still enrolled into the study. Among completers, BRZA use was reduced among most of them from baseline to 12 weeks. So you can see this is just telling a story of the 5 participants. This slide was prepared a month ago. We're seeing consistent results. Obviously, these preliminary results with no control group, but people are deprescribing. So what have we learned thus far? Electronic screening is very inefficient. You end up with a lot of noise with people who aren't actively using benzos. Older adults don't answer electronic messages or phone calls. Difficult. Hybrid studies. This is a hybrid study, so we build for some services with the nurse practitioner, the acupuncture, and yoga we covered. It's a mess to figure that out from a logistical standpoint, from research. People are getting bills. They're worried. They don't want to come to visits. Delivering study treatments in a routine schedule of a provider is very difficult, right? Because they have to intermix research studies. We need to block time for those treatment providers. Older adults need time to transition between treatments. We didn't take this into account, but they have to go to the bathroom. They walk slowly between acupuncture and yoga. Small details makes the visit much longer. It's not an hour and a half, it's 2.5 hours. Small details that we learned about. We did learn a lot about the optimal sequence of treatments. We think the optimal sequence is you see the nurse practitioner, you get the yoga, and then you get the acupuncture out the door. That was the best flow of sequence, logistically and from a patient experience. We realized we need to dichotomize treatments for people who are PRN users of benzos versus people who use it every day. The treatment's different. We don't have time to go into the details, but we think the protocol needs to be different between those 2 types of patients who are using those medications. We had to do modifications to the yoga, which was anticipated. Acupuncture was challenged by, they wanted to treat other conditions. So if someone is up at night because of back pain and they know they can treat it with acupuncture, well, what do you treat? So that was very hard. Something we have to think about restricting what or we can treat or not treat with the conditions. Those are the lessons learned. Thank you to all my co-investigators and team, including Amanda, who helped with this project. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for having me and for funding this project. We're working on a study of Yoga Nidra, which is a guided meditation technique, seeing if it could be feasible as a practice for helping decrease insomnia and anxiety for people who are taking benzodiazepines and may like to decrease how many of them they're using. So many people have issues with sleep and anxiety. It can be treated with benzodiazepines, but as we all know, it's important to taper those eventually. I have been spending the past several years studying Yoga Nidra as a very accessible, passive, low-cost, and rapid-acting intervention that can help with insomnia and anxiety. It's a guided meditation, so you just lay down and close your eyes. You don't need to wear anything special. You don't need to be able to move in any certain way. It's very approachable for older adults who may have differing levels of physical movement or ability. And we've been studying it remotely, so using a recording, so it can be distributed widely and easily, and it's free to use. Traditionally, Yoga Nidra is also used to break bad habits and addiction. So there's been spontaneous reports of someone's practicing Yoga Nidra and they just stopped smoking because they began to understand what was good for them. So it seems very promising in a setting of people who may need to taper some medications. Our original trial design was different than what we're ending up with now. We proposed like a 6-week trial with tapering and with sleep monitoring. We've had to move our trial first to the VA and then to UCSD. We have gone through 3 IRB reviews for many different reasons. And we finally are recruiting, so I'm happy to say that. It's been kind of reduced to a very simple feasibility trial. So we're trying to see, can we find people? We're shooting for 100 people. And I guess what I've heard is it may be difficult to recruit. So we're shooting for 100. We've got like 12 so far. We started about a month ago. Looking at feasibility, will they practice? Will they find it easy enough to access? And do we see an impact on anxiety and insomnia? And rather than guiding people through tapering, we're going to find out, do they become motivated to taper? Are they interested in joining a future trial where we will taper their use? So we're using Epic queries and MyChart invitations. Hopefully these people will answer. We've been doing some phone screenings, and it'll be an 8-week trial crossover design. So 2 weeks getting yoga nidra as compared to education intervention where they learn about insomnia, anxiety, and benzodiazepine use. And then each group crosses over and tries the other for 2 weeks. They continue to have access to both interventions for 4 more weeks. So we'll track whether people continue to use the yoga nidra meditation or access educational materials during that time. And we'll be tracking changes in anxiety and sleep and motivation to decrease their use of benzodiazepines. So we started finally on April 9th, 2 years after we got funded, sending out notices through MyChart to about 650 people. Within the month, over 100 people are interested, and we have our study coordinator running phone screens. 42 people were screened, 12 are eligible. Maybe notably, 30 people who were ineligible, their reason was that they weren't taking benzodiazepines frequently enough based on the criteria we set. We set, based on some other studies, like 3 months of use at 3 times per week. And interestingly, there were a lot of people who wanted to try this, whose motivation was they don't want to become addicted to it. So they want to like proactively try an alternative, but we excluded them. So we're thinking about whether we should expand that and maybe see some feasibility on people who are proactive in this space. So takeaways, hopefully we'll find that it's feasible and we can move on to a more structured tapering intervention. Hopefully we can see whether it affects anxiety or sleep. And like we as a study team have learned about patience, flexibility, diligence, and being resilient and trying to get this trial done. And I hope that we have more to share at the next meeting. And so thank you so much for the funding and opportunity to run this. Dr. Ryan Bradley, who's the PI, couldn't be here today. Thank you for him for all the guidance. And we've got our, very important team of grants managers and collaborators and our study coordinator who's currently doing enrollment.
So now we would like to invite our panelists to engage in a conversation led by Dr. Fung and Dr. Saliv.
So first of all, I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to be able to hear from the 4 speakers, how challenging it is to go and find individuals who, you say, I'm here to ask you whether you want to stop this medication that you use for your anxiety and for your insomnia, with this difficult times that we're in, do you want to be in my study? So first I want to ask us to give a big round of applause to our 4. It really is quite challenging. Wanted to start by posing the question for each one of you. What do you feel is different in approaching this type of deprescribing trial as in comparison to perhaps a different study that you've been involved in? And we can start with, you were first.
Sure. Well, to your point, not everyone who's on these medications wants to give them up, right? So we're starting from a relative disadvantage compared to other trials where you might be advertising something that is more appealing. Like, do you want to help with your stress? Do you want to have more positive emotions in your life, right? That is more broadly appealing. I think another thing that's important about these trials is the importance of partnering with kind of the clinical setting. And so I know that our group personally has a lot of work to do there to improve that, to help have a better way of reaching people and following through.
I would say, compared to other research studies I've done, this is probably the more complicated intervention because we included 2 additional active treatments, and usually we're studying 1. So that was ambitious, and yet the patients did seem to like it, but that was one of the feasibility questions. So I'd say the same. That's one of the things. And most of my studies have been behavioral interventions, and we look secondarily at changes in medication. This primarily includes a medication change actively with it, so that's something that's different and exciting to see some changes.
For me, I think coming from it's the National University of Natural Medicine, so a lot of us are doing studies on complementary integrative health, and so we're kind of in the space of we're not treating disease. We're like supporting good health, and we're looking at like subclinical conditions. So a lot of people who aren't taking medication. So this within our research group was kind of like a new way to look at what we can do. Actually go into the world of pharmacy and see, can we help people use less of their medication? So it's a little bit of a new way to look at populations we can do research in.
And Dr. Anderson?
So I'm historically not a trialist, so all of it was new to me. But beyond that, I think, even thinking about primary care practice, if we were offering patients to come off almost any other med class, I think people would be chomping at the bit. So often people want to reduce their meds, but the challenges of engaging people to think about reducing benzodiazepines, I think was just harder than I would have even guessed. And a lot of that, in reflecting with the patients we talked with, was either due to failed prior attempts or simply a lack of any awareness of risks. And so often the people we engaged with were those who were aware of risks and aware that things didn't go well last time they stopped and kind of were pre-motivated.
And I also with the with your IRB, when you were approaching them, I mean, one experience that I had was that the IRB forms really weren't set up for deprescribing like a medication. And so it was all about, starting a medication and so did you encounter some challenges with and how did you handle those?
Yes. Such a good point. We normally our trials of this intervention get sent to like our social and behavioral IRB, and this one got sent to our biomedical IRB. And I understand it, but there was a lack of understanding from their side then on kind of the factors that normally we are taking in these kinds of trials. It was hard to meet in the middle, and we had a lot of back and forth with them, a lot of questions that we had to tackle before we could even get started.
We didn't have any challenges with the IRB, to be honest with you. I think we overkilled the IRB with precautions. So we did CUA-B like weekly, and we actually think it's pretty much unnecessary because the way we tapered was so very gradual. That's for withdrawal symptoms who people don't know you use when you're withdrawing people from controlled substances. But we didn't have any problems with that. The one thing that was interesting is to access, because benzodiazepines are a controlled substance, and to do the electronic screening, it had to actually go through a specific committee at the institution and a specific informatics core that had to create the search criteria because they wanted to protect patients who are on controlled substances. So it's not a normal query into the EHR. So that was an additional loophole, but no IRB issues.
And for us, we've gone through 3 of them. The first one, I think they didn't have too much to say. We took a lot of precautions, and I think at the advice also of the USDeN, who gave some tips to us, make sure we have a lot of contact with the primary care physician and the psychiatrist that was on our team throughout the tapering process, and see what we plan to use as well. And then we started off proposing like a nationwide fully remote trial, but the psychiatrist after COVID, he was practicing, remotely across state lines, but then we were funded after COVID, and all of a sudden he could only practice in Birmingham. So we had to put our population in Birmingham, go through their IRB. Their feedback, I think they were more interested in some in-person monitoring with the benzodiazepine reduction. So we were shifting our trial maybe more towards in-person people so that the psychiatrist there could see them and observe what was happening and help them more closely. And then when the project moved to UCSD, because the PI, Ryan, he moved over there, we changed it more to feasibility. So not so much deprescribing, but the IRB has us be very careful with not telling people to decrease use, but we're just monitoring if they decide to and if they become interested in it. So we have to be careful about how we talk about it.
Dr. Anderson, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would say our IRB was mainly focused on times we were assessing severe symptoms and kind of the follow-up plan as to how to ensure patient safety, which to me is no different than, any study in which you might ever kind of ask people about depression or anxiety symptoms. They really weren't all that focused on, it being different that we're taking meds off rather than on. Some of that may have had to do with the fact that we really emphasized that this was a patient-led tapering program. And so patients had the option to say, like, I don't want to taper this coming week. And I think that lessened some of the concern from what like a very strict tapering program might otherwise face with concerns about patient safety.
I want to give Dr. Saliv an opportunity to ask a question.
Okay, thanks, Constance. I wanted to thank everyone for being there, and I wanted to thank people for the invitation to participate in this session. I'm from National Institute on Aging, and as was mentioned, program officer for the network. So I'm very glad you're having the meeting in person, and I wish we could see the room so that I could have like some sense of that. But NIA is very supportive of research on aging and ways to improve health of the older population. So I think this fits right in to our mission. And, we have a big focus on chronic condition management, and definitely this is part of that. We collaborated with the National Center on Integrative Health, which was Pete Murray, who was, I think, supposed to be here today, but Pete is not. But I'm kind of pitch hitting for that. So I wanted to ask about, thinking back on what you've got so far. What would you do differently now, or how will you tweak this as you may go forward? Or if it's too early, that's okay. Just we heard a lot of issues on recruitment, but also the intervention. Anything there that you might be interested in doing differently? Thanks.
We could go in reverse order. Start with Dr. Anderson.
Sure. So I think the biggest feedback we got from participants was a suggestion that we make the program even longer, which was kind of antithetical to what we had pitched, which was that the challenge with historical benzo tapering programs is they go on for like years, and that's just not sustainable in the US healthcare system. But one of the things we're trying to think about in terms of next steps is how to right size the length to be both feasible that it might actually be taken up in routine care, but helpful to patients. The other big piece of feedback we got was really a question from some participants on whether the CPT component was necessary. Some felt like, what I need is a pharmacist who checks in with me regularly and supports me, whereas others found it valuable. And a lot of where that has led us is thinking about that the subsequent study or larger trial may really be a comparison of pharmacist tapering versus pharmacist tapering enhanced with CPT, rather than kind of some sort of usual care placebo arm.
Well, our first major hurdle was the licensure and practicing across state lines for a fully remote nationwide trial. It ended up not being like possible as we wanted it to be. I'm not sure we could have really seen that coming, but if it were possible to do that, I would wish that. As far as changes that we may make to the trial, I guess I'm curious what other people think about opening it up to people who are like more concerned about preventing their dependence on the medication versus recruiting people who are already dependent and interested in tapering. So like I would actually be interested in some input on that because we're at the point of deciding whether we should open it up.
Well, we're still doing the study. I think, the goal is to look at the data and the results. We're doing focus groups at the end and really make a manualized protocol from what we learned, and then set up to do hopefully a comparative effectiveness trial, be it a pilot or a study. So that's our goal. I think there are lots of things that we would have modified and refined. I think the general structure will probably keep the same. I think there is this question though of what is the goal of what we're doing by giving these treatments, because this came up. We sort of had this return to condition challenge, right? The acupuncture is used really on a short-term basis to help people come off the medication so they improves their anxiety and their sleep. And the yoga is a long-term behavioral treatment. But if you only do it for 12 weeks and then you drop them off, behavior goes down. Will they continue to do it? So, when we're going forward, we really got to say, what's our goal? Obviously, this was short-term. We'd need 6-month, 1-year outcomes, which we can do in a larger trial. But I think that actually might mean that we have to change how we're thinking about our treatment intervention. Right now, we distilled it to an intense treatment in 12 weeks. And we really need to think about it as a drip approach over 6 months or 12 months, which is much more practical from a behavioral standpoint.
So I mentioned, we had some challenges with recruitment that I think we may need some kind of tailored recruitment strategies for various groups that we're talking with some of our community advisors about with doing this in the future. I also have a colleague who does some work in medical decision making, and I think that might be a nice complement to enrolling people in the first place and engaging them sort of in this overall idea of deprescribing, and then being able to offer them something that goes along with it, like this intervention, could be a really nice package. We also heard from people, not everyone wants to be in a group, but we did hear from many of our participants about the appeal of connecting with other people who are going through a similar thing, who may have some shared interests or shared experiences in life, that at least part of a group component, if it's structured well, could help with engagement in the skills and retention. So that's another direction we'll explore too.
So I wanted to, you raised a question about 3 times a week, right? Versus perhaps maybe if it's 1 or 2 times a week, or maybe right. Any of you have thoughts on, did you encounter some issues with the frequency as your inclusion criteria?
Yeah, inclusion criteria. I think it was based on a previous tapering study that we had seen. It was, they should be using them for at least 3 months and taking them 3 times a week. I don't know what other inclusion criteria other groups used.
We had only 2 times a week.
Okay.
And I don't recall that was a barrier to enrollment for us.
And I think we looked at exposure over the last few months. I can't remember the actual inclusion criteria, but they had to meet it within a certain number over a few months, which might explain why we had so many PRN users, or some, which we do think affects our treatment, how we're going to deliver it.
Dr. Anderson?
I think originally we actually required daily use. We may have flexed that for a couple people who kind of said, I use it 5 or 6 days a week, but we did not include people who were really low dose users. And that actually became one of the big exclusion criteria, just in terms of contacting people, because it could be hard to tease out the PRN use using health records.
But my thought when you were posing that question, I mean, we just were hearing earlier today about the difference in presenting to people on the front end as you're prescribing something, what the potential risks are, right? And how that changes their mindset and their openness to the idea of, I'm not going to be on this forever. This is a temporary treatment or solution that I will eventually taper or stop, right? So to me, that argues for expanding it, and especially for a medication class like benzodiazepines that we know, can be addictive over the long term, and, really trying to intervene on the front end and being more inclusive to prevent those people from developing long-term use. So to me, it makes a lot of sense for you to expand the inclusion.
Okay. And then see if they just can keep their dose low.
Right.
That would be that.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was going to share that for my trial, we started off with thinking about this, three times a week or more, and we were, concerned about getting through IRB, and we're like, well, they're using it for almost half the time, and then as we thought about it more, I was like, well, why not do 2 times per week or more? I mean, I don't know that these patients need to be on these medications. And if we get them either to a lower dose or completely discontinued, it could be very beneficial. And so we ended up changing our inclusion criteria. We didn't make very many changes, but that was one, because we were finding that as we were screening, so we would get lists, and we would call people, get their frequency. And we found that there were a number of people who were using it two times a week, or we even found people with one time a week, and we didn't end up recruiting, although I think that those patients also could have benefited. Dr. Saliv, do you have additional questions?
Yeah. So I guess I'm reflecting on the different approaches people had. Now that you've heard the discussion, it seemed like, one had a pharmacist approach, one had, I think a couple had more yoga approaches. Is there some opportunities that you're thinking about from this exposure to other alternative approaches from the discussion today, of considering other expertise as you move ahead? I know it's kind of a vague question, maybe.
Perhaps we'll start with Dr. Sharp.
Like other interventions that we might use. I would have to think about that. I know of a lot of potential mind-body type of approaches that could be used, or even natural products that, supplements that could be used as replacements. So yeah, lots of ideas.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think it comes from our treatment interventions, not from some empiric theory. It's based on practical experience of how you help older patients. So if you're over 65 and you come see me and I need to give you an intervention, I'm going to tell you to go to do yoga and acupuncture, because clinically, based on our experience, it works. It has very little side effects. And I think it's something of interest that older people should have access to other than drugs. And that was the intention of the study, and we have lots of experience delivering it. I imagine your intervention sounds like it's a pivot from what you used in other populations, right? Like in terms of applying it in this specific, you have a lot of clinical experience delivering it.
Yes, and we have used this intervention or variations of it with a lot of different populations. My general thinking is that there's no one thing for everyone, and different people have different preferences. And so what I think would be really exciting is if we all get a little bit further down the road and then maybe combine forces and end up with some kind of pragmatic trial in the future where not necessarily to pit these against one another, but to see what works for different populations and in different contexts.
Dr. Anderson?
I'm not sure I have anything great to add. I'm kind of a pragmatist, and so a lot of times I tend to try to think of what are the resources already, at least theoretically, available nearby patients in primary care that don't involve new reimbursement models and things like that. And that's a lot of the reason we oriented towards psychologist and pharmacist-led programs that were kind of people already working for a clinic. But I think, any evaluation of these things or kind of expansion is reliant on the idea of whether people can access the service, whether it's psychologists, yoga, or other techniques. And I think that becomes a particularly important thing for kind of trying to scale these successful interventions.
So I have a question about approach, given that benzodiazepine medications and Z drugs are used for sleep, but benzos are used for a variety of conditions. And so, what types of challenges arise when and how do you sort of approach when you're talking about medications that are used for a variety of different conditions? How does that influence your intervention, and how does it influence your recruitment and the outcomes?
Sure. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think that part of our challenge was having so many people who were focused on sleep, and that's not really what our intervention was tailored before. We have seen in other populations improvements in sleep disturbances from this intervention, but that's really more of a secondary outcome. And so to your question, part of what matters, I think, with our intervention is these skills can be applied to a lot of different contexts and, sort of any type of stress, if I'm just generalizing, in life. But for people to take it up, they need to see themselves reflected in the intervention. They need to see examples of applying the skills to that particular concern that they're targeting. And so I think we almost need different variations for potentially different conditions within this population that people might want to improve.
We excluded patients who were taking benzos for conditions other than anxiety and insomnia, and that was specifically what we found. Restless leg syndrome and vertigo were the most common prescriptions in our screening, so those were excluded. If they had it as a secondary condition, we still excluded them. So basically, we isolated to anxiety and insomnia. I think the question is, though, which I alluded to, is what if there's another condition that they're masking that's disturbing their sleep or making them anxious, and then our treatments treating that, or the primary anxiety or that condition. We had our protocols were flexible to allow the providers, for acupuncture, use points for sleep and use points for stress. But then the question is, beyond that, should we allow that? And that's something we're gonna have to figure out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that all these pilot projects utilize some form of like a mind-body practice. And I think the beauty of that is that it's holistic in the sense, you're targeting many things at once. So sleep can be helped, anxiety, depression, so many things, even just sense of self, and that can expand to so many different conditions. So I think the interventions we chose seem to have chosen carefully that they can impact many things at once. And it'll be interesting to learn, the mechanism, how it relates really to what benzodiazepines are doing. But I think it's holistic in the sense that it can target many things.
Dr. Anderson?
Agreed with others. Nothing to add.
I was just going to mention for my trial, we did encounter some scenarios where, as you were mentioning, it potentially could have unmasked. For example, like there was an interesting patient who had, I think it was sleep eating, and then we ended up excluding, or at least stopping the intervention for that patient, as we're concerned that perhaps there could be some that patient needed more evaluation. But how are we doing on time? I see Mike standing there. 3 minutes. Okay. All right.
Well, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody on the panel and our discussants. And I think we missed Dr. Sleeve being online earlier. So we just wanted to thank him for his ongoing strong support of USD Prescribing Research Network on behalf of Mike and Cynthia. We really appreciate you being part of the conversation today and always as part of this network. So a round of applause for everybody, please.